The first time I woke up with her lying beside me, I remember how the air felt almost sacred. The curtains were half closed, letting in a soft, pale light that painted her skin with a glow that made my chest ache in the best way. Her breathing was steady, slow, the kind of rhythm that told me she felt safe, and that thought alone sent warmth through me. I turned slightly, just enough to see her face more clearly, and for a few seconds I simply let myself memorize it, the curve of her lips, the faint crease near her brow that always appeared when she was dreaming deeply, the way her hair tumbled across the pillow and over my arm like it had always belonged there. In that moment, nothing else in the world mattered. It was just us, and I wanted it to stay that way forever. I whispered her name, not because I wanted to wake her, but because I needed to hear how it sounded in the silence. The sound slipped from me softly, like a prayer. She stirred, not fully waking, only shifting closer until her forehead brushed against my shoulder. That small touch broke something inside me. It was fragile, delicate, like I was holding on to the rarest treasure, and all I could think about was how badly I wanted to protect it, protect her, protect us. I pressed my lips against her hair, breathing in that familiar scent that was a mixture of lavender and the faintest trace of her perfume, and my chest tightened because I had never felt this way before. I never thought I would be the kind of person who could love with such intensity, but with her, it wasn't a choice. It just happened, overwhelming and consuming, like a tide that swept me off my feet before I even realized I had been standing near the shore. Everything about her pulled me in. The sound of her laughter when she teased me late at night, the way her eyes seemed to search mine whenever she was about to confess something honest, even the way she got nervous and bit her lip before speaking about her past, it was all etched into me. I used to think I knew what love was, but with her, I learned it had depth I hadn't even imagined. That morning, as she finally opened her eyes, I saw the faint sleepiness give way to a smile that was so tender it nearly unraveled me. She reached out lazily, fingertips grazing my arm before resting on my chest, and the softness of that gesture stayed with me long after. I told her, quietly, that I loved her. The words came out without hesitation, without fear. They didn't hang heavy in the air like confessions sometimes do. They floated, light and certain, and she answered with her own, her voice still husky from sleep, saying she loved me too. My heart raced, but not in panic, it was joy, pure and raw. We lay there. I thought about how impossible it would be to explain this feeling to anyone else. To anyone on the outside, it might look ordinary, two women tangled in sheets, whispering, smiling, sharing a quiet morning. But inside me, it was extraordinary. It was life-shaping. I felt as if every part of me was finally understood, finally seen. There was no judgment, no masks, no need to pretend. With her, I was free. The world outside could have been on fire, and I still wouldn't have cared. Her touch was the anchor that kept me steady, and her voice was the melody that made me feel alive. I didn't notice the silence beyond our walls, the faint hum of the city waking up, or the way the shadows crept along the ceiling. All I could focus on was her, the woman in my bed, the woman who had unknowingly become the center of my world. I thought, foolishly maybe, that this was what forever looked like. And in that moment, I promised myself I would never let anything take this away. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't possibly have imagined as she kissed me softly and laughed when I brushed the hair from her face, was that someone had already decided to intrude into the sacredness of our love. Someone had already crossed into our world without permission. For now, though, I remained blissfully unaware, wrapped in the warmth of her body and the illusion that we were untouchable. My heart was wide open, vulnerable in ways I didn't yet understand, and every beat of it belonged to her. The days that followed blurred together in a soft haze of affection and routine, yet underneath that sweetness something faint began to gnaw at me. At first, I ignored it, brushing it off as nothing more than my overactive mind. Love has a way of amplifying every little detail, making you sensitive to shifts that might not even exist, and I thought maybe that was all it was. But then I started noticing things, small, almost unremarkable moments that left me unsettled. It began with the phone. She had always been private with it, but now the secrecy felt heavier. Every time it rang, she would slip into the kitchen or the bathroom, her voice lowered to a whisper. When she returned, she would smile too quickly, as if the expression was meant to distract me from asking questions. Her eyes would linger on mine for a second too long, almost pleading, almost apologizing, and though I wanted to trust her, something deep inside whispered that trust wasn't enough. At night, when we lay together, her touch still carried warmth, her laughter still filled the room, but there were pauses now, tiny breaks where silence seemed to press too firmly against us. She would reach for me, but sometimes her hand trembled before she found my skin, and it left me wondering what weight she was carrying that she hadn't told me. I could feel the change in the way her body pressed against mine, as if she wanted to be closer but something invisible was pulling her away. Those quiet hesitations hurt more than I could admit, because they weren't things you could point to directly. They weren't obvious betrayals or clear lies. They were shadows, faint but persistent, that lingered in every corner of our home. I told myself that love meant patience, that everyone had secrets, that maybe she was dealing with something too painful to speak of yet. But then there were the other moments. One night, as I drifted in and out of sleep, I thought I heard a faint clicking sound, like static. It came from near the bed, barely audible, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. I sat up slowly, straining my ears, but it stopped as quickly as it began. She stirred beside me, pulling me back down gently, murmuring for me to rest. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks, but even after I closed my eyes again, I couldn't shake the unease curling tight in my chest. During the day, it became a game of second-guessing myself. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside our apartment felt too frequent, too deliberate. Strangers' eyes seemed to linger longer than they should when we walked down the street together. Once, when I bent down to tie my shoes near the door, I thought I saw something metallic glinting near the floorboard, but when I leaned closer, it was gone, as if swallowed by the shadows. I laughed at myself quietly, told myself I was slipping into paranoia, but the laughter rang hollow in the empty room. Through all of this, she remained loving, tender, and real. That made the confusion even worse. When she cupped my face in her hands and kissed me deeply, I felt the truth of her affection. When she traced her fingers down my arm and whispered that I was her world, I believed her. Yet the doubt lingered, threading itself into the spaces between her words, her gestures, her smiles. It was like loving two versions of her at once, the woman who made me feel like the luckiest person alive, and the woman who carried a secret I couldn't name. I began lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling while she slept soundly beside me. My mind turned over every interaction, every unexplained moment, searching for answers that wouldn't come. I remembered the first time she had looked at me with those eyes full of promise, and I couldn't reconcile that memory with the growing fear in my chest. I told myself that if something was wrong, she would tell me. I told myself love demanded trust. But as the night stretched on, that faith began to tremble. Every sigh, every pause, every whispered phone call weighed on me. I wanted to ask her, to demand the truth, but I couldn't bring myself to risk breaking what we had, not yet.so I stayed silent. I wrapped my arms around her when she shifted in her sleep, burying my face in her hair as if the closeness could chase away the questions. I kissed her shoulder gently, hoping that maybe the doubt was just a phase, that it would fade as quickly as it had come. But deep down, I knew. Something was wrong. Something was watching us, listening to us, creeping into the sacred space we had built. I didn't have proof, only the tight knot in my stomach and the restless thoughts that stole my sleep, but I could feel it. Our love wasn't as private as I believed it to be. And though I tried to ignore it, I knew the truth was waiting just ahead, sharp and unavoidable. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind of day where the sunlight draped itself lazily across the floor and the air was still enough to make the room feel timeless. She had gone out for groceries, humming a tune as she closed the door behind her, and I stayed behind, folding laundry at the edge of the bed. It was such an ordinary task, so simple, yet the moment shifted in a way I could never have predicted. As I lifted one of her shirts, a faint tug caught at the fabric where it had slipped between the mattress and the frame. I pulled harder, thinking it had snagged on a spring or nail, but instead something strange came loose, a wire, thin and black, curling out like a secret that had been hiding in plain sight. For a moment, I just stared, frozen, my mind refusing to process what my eyes saw. It didn't belong there. It couldn't belong there. My breath quickened, my palms went clammy, and I felt my whole body go cold despite the warm sunlight streaming over me. I bent closer, heart hammering in my chest, and followed the wire with trembling fingers. It snaked down the side of the frame, disappearing into a small, almost invisible device tucked neatly beneath. My throat tightened as if someone had gripped it, cutting off air. 1,000 thoughts raced through me all at once. Was this some kind of prank? Was it hers? Was it mine? Who would do this? The weight of betrayal crashed into me before I could even sort the questions. This was our bed. This was where we laughed, whispered secrets, clung to each other in the night. And someone, whether it was her or someone else, had pierced that sacred place with something ugly, something that didn't belong. My hands shook as I pulled at it, not knowing if I should rip it out or leave it there. Every instinct screamed that I was exposed, that the walls I thought kept us safe had been peeled open and turned inside out. I felt dirty, as if all those tender moments, every I love you, every touch, every whispered confession, had been stolen and replayed for unseen ears. My stomach churned and I nearly doubled over, struggling to steady myself. I couldn't shake the thought of someone listening to me when I cried in her arms, when I told her about my fears, when I held her and thought we were untouchable. The intimacy we shared wasn't just ours anymore, it had been invaded, dissected, turned into something I didn't recognize. I sat on the floor, clutching the wire in my hand, staring at the tiny device as though it were alive. My chest heaved with shallow breaths. Part of me wanted to run, to grab my coat and flee before she came back. Another part wanted to scream at her, demand answers, demand the truth. But louder than both was the fear that maybe she already knew, that maybe she had placed it there herself. The thought sliced through me like glass. Could the woman who kissed me with such sincerity, who traced her fingers over my skin as if she wanted to memorize me, really be the same person who would let someone spy on us? The possibility hollowed me out. Memories flashed across my mind like cruel reminders, the hushed phone calls, the way she sometimes paused mid-sentence as if weighing her words, the strange moments of hesitation when I reached for her. I wanted so desperately to deny the connection, but the evidence was right there in my hand, undeniable. I tried to imagine an explanation that didn't end with betrayal, but every scenario I painted collapsed under the weight of that little wire. It felt like a snake coiled in my palm, poisonous, mocking, whispering that my love story was never as pure as I thought it was. I forced myself to put it back, tucking it under the bed again, as if hiding it could make it less real. But the knowledge was already carved into me. I couldn't unsee it, couldn't unknow it. I sat there for a long time, staring at the bed, feeling as though the walls had closed in around me. Every corner of the room seemed different now, less safe, less mine. Even the air felt heavier, charged with something sinister. I wanted to curl up and cry, but tears wouldn't come. Instead, I felt hollow, like something precious had been carved out of me. When I finally heard the door open and her voice call my name, my whole body stiffened. My heart lurched into my throat. I couldn't move at first, couldn't even turn to face her. I didn't know whether to throw myself into her arms and pretend I hadn't seen anything, or to confront her and risk destroying everything in one breath. The sound of her footsteps drawing closer echoed in my head, each one pounding like a drum. And for the first time since I had fallen in love with her, I felt afraid of what the truth might be when I finally asked the question I didn't want answered. She came into the room carrying a bag of groceries, her hair slightly windblown from outside, her face lit with that familiar smile that usually made my chest soften. But this time, when her eyes met mine, I couldn't return it. I sat on the edge of the bed, stiff, my hands pressed hard against my knees to keep them from trembling. She spoke lightly, telling me the strawberries had been on sale, asking if I wanted to make pancakes later, and her voice was so natural, so normal, that for a split second I wondered if I had imagined everything. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to nod at the right moments, but inside my head the world had shifted. I could still feel the thin wire against my skin, still see that black coil snaking down beneath the bed, still hear the silence that pressed against me when I realized what it meant. I studied her closely as she moved around the room. Every gesture, every glance, every casual touch she gave me now carried a different weight. When she reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face, my body flinched before I could stop it, and her hand lingered for a second, her eyes narrowing slightly, searching mine. I forced a smile to cover it, but I knew she noticed. I hated myself in that moment because I didn't know if the person I was looking at was the woman I loved or someone I had never really known at all. Her laugh, her warmth, her easy charm, it all felt like a disguise I had been blind to, and that realization burned like acid in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. She curled up against me as always, her arm draped over my waist, her breathing slow and steady. But I lay there wide awake, staring into the dark. My eyes traced the outline of the ceiling, but all I could see was the wire. I thought about how many nights someone had listened to us here, how many moments of vulnerability had been stolen. I remembered whispering my fears into her shoulder, confessing the things I had never told anyone else, believing I was safe in her arms. I wondered if all of that had been recorded, If strangers had dissected my every word while I had been naive enough to think love was my protection. The humiliation burned hotter than the betrayal itself. I started avoiding her eyes during the day. When she asked me questions, I answered softly, vaguely, unwilling to reveal too much. My chest hurt every time she looked at me with concern, asking if I was tired or if something was wrong. I wanted to scream at her, to demand she explain herself, but I couldn't do it. The thought of hearing the truth from her lips terrified me more than silence. I wasn't ready to see her break, to see her admit that what we had was nothing more than a performance played out under someone else's watch. So I chose distance instead, wrapping myself in quiet, letting her believe I was distracted or stressed. Memories of happier moments haunted me. I would see her across the room, standing at the counter making tea, her back curved slightly as she stirred sugar into the cup, and I would suddenly remember the first time she cooked for me, how she had danced around the kitchen barefoot and laughed when she spilled sauce on her shirt. Those memories used to bring me joy, but now they cut like knives, because they made me question whether even those moments had been real. I replayed every conversation in my head, wondering which words had been hers and which had been carefully chosen for whoever was listening. Every kiss, every laugh, every tear suddenly looked different under the shadow of that wire, and I hated myself for still loving her in spite of it all. One evening, she came to me with her usual tenderness, wrapping her arms around me from behind as I stood by the window. Her chin rested on my shoulder, and her voice was soft as she whispered that she had missed me, that I felt far away lately. My throat tightened, and I had to bite down hard to keep from crying. I wanted to turn and tell her everything, about the wire, about the fear, about the sick feeling that our love had been contaminated, but the words stuck in my chest like thorns. Instead, I stood there frozen, nodding slightly, letting her believe the lie that I was just tired, that nothing was wrong. I told myself I needed more time, that I needed to be sure, but deep down I knew I was only postponing the inevitable. The distance between us grew heavier with each passing day. I moved through our home like a ghost, pretending, smiling when I had to, holding her when she reached for me, but inside I was unraveling. At night, when she touched me, I let her, but my mind replayed the discovery over and over, robbing the intimacy of its safety. She whispered that she loved me, and though I whispered it back, the words felt fractured, caught between truth and doubt. I still loved her with everything in me, but love had begun to feel like a wound instead of a refuge. And the longer I carried that secret, the sharper the ache became. By the time I finally admitted to myself that I couldn't keep pretending, I felt hollowed out, worn down by silence. I knew the moment was coming when I would have to choose, to demand the truth and risk losing her forever, or to keep living in the shadow of doubt until it consumed me completely. As I lay beside her one night, watching her sleep peacefully while I stared into the darkness, I realized I had already chosen. I couldn't keep quiet. The truth, no matter how devastating, was the only way forward. And the thought of finally asking her about that wire filled me with both dread and the faintest flicker of hope, that maybe, just maybe, there was an explanation I hadn't thought of yet. The morning I finally gathered the courage to speak felt strangely ordinary at first, as if the world hadn't been building toward this moment all along. Sunlight spilled across the floor, and she was at the table sipping her coffee, her hair pulled into a loose bun, her eyes softened by the glow. I sat across from her with my hands wrapped tightly around my mug, though I hadn't taken a sip. My stomach churned, and my throat was so dry I could barely swallow. For days I had rehearsed what I might say, how I might begin, but when the silence stretched between us, all the carefully chosen words unraveled. What finally came out was raw and stripped bare. "Why is there a wire under our bed?" The sound of my voice broke the stillness like glass shattering. Her eyes snapped up to mine, wide and startled, and the color drained from her face. The mug in her hand trembled just slightly before she set it down. For a long moment she didn't answer, and in that silence I felt every possible outcome collapse in on me. My chest tightened as I waited, fear and anger tangling together until I could barely breathe. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked like she hadn't prepared for this moment, like she had been hoping I would never ask. She whispered that she hadn't wanted me to find out like this, that it was complicated, that she had been trying to protect me. I didn't understand. Protect me? My voice shook as I demanded to know who she was protecting me from, who had put that device there, and why it was there at all. She looked at me with tears beginning to blur her eyes, and the pain in her gaze was almost unbearable. She confessed then, haltingly, stumbling over words as though each one weighed too much. She told me she had been pressured into something she couldn't refuse, that someone had come to her with threats, with demands. At first, she had resisted, but fear for her safety, and mine, had twisted her into a corner. The wire, she admitted, had been forced upon her. She hadn't wanted it. She swore she hated it as much as I did. Her voice broke as she explained that she couldn't find a way out, that she was terrified of what might happen if she disobeyed. As I listened, torn between disbelief and desperate hope, my heart waged a war against my mind. Part of me wanted to believe her, to hold on to the idea that she was still the woman who whispered love into my skin at night. But another part of me recoiled, furious that she hadn't trusted me enough to share this sooner, furious that she had let me live in a lie. I asked her how long it had been there, my voice sharper than I intended, and when she answered, my heart sank. Weeks. Weeks of stolen intimacy, of hidden betrayal, of secrets kept while she looked me in the eye and told me I was her world. I slammed my mug down, the sound echoing through the room, and demanded how she could claim to love me while letting strangers invade the most sacred parts of our lives. Her tears spilled freely then, rolling down her cheeks as she reached across the table, begging me to understand, to see that she had been trying to shield me, even if she had failed. She said she had thought about telling me every day but had been too afraid, too trapped. She said she was sorry, over and over, like the words could undo the damage. I wanted to stand up and walk out, to put distance between myself and the mess of betrayal and excuses, but I couldn't move. My body felt rooted to the chair, heavy with anger and grief. I stared at her through blurred eyes of my own, realizing I still loved her so deeply it hurt more than the betrayal itself. And that was the cruelest part, love didn't just vanish because truth had shattered it. My chest ached with the contradiction of wanting to hold her and wanting to never see her again. I told her as much, my voice breaking, confessing that I didn't know how to reconcile the woman who kissed me like I was everything with the woman who had let me be spied on in my own bed. She reached for my hand again, trembling, and this time I didn't pull away. Her palm was clammy, her grip desperate. She promised she would make it right, that she would rip the device out herself, that she would face whoever was behind it if that's what it took. She swore she wasn't lying, that her love for me was real, and I felt the weight of those words pressing against my shattered trust. In that moment, I realized I was standing on the edge of a choice. I could let the betrayal end us, or I could take the risk of believing her, of believing that love could still exist beneath the mess of lies and fear. My heart was torn open as I sat there, listening to her sob, watching her fall apart in front of me. I wanted to scream, to demand more answers, but instead I let her cry against my hand, the salt of her tears soaking into my skin. A strange calm settled over me, not because I forgave her, but because I knew there was no running from this anymore. The truth was out now, raw and ugly, and we would either face it together or watch everything we had collapse. My chest heaved with shaky breaths, and though my heart still ached with betrayal, a quiet part of me clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. That evening felt like walking through fire barefoot, every step raw, every breath scorching, but I knew we couldn't stay in silence anymore. After her confession, after the sobs and the promises, I felt hollowed out, drained of all strength, yet there was a quiet resolve growing inside me. I told her we needed to deal with it now, not tomorrow, not later, but now, because if we kept living with that thing under our bed, if we kept pretending, the poison of it would seep further into everything we had left. She nodded quickly, wiping her face, her hands still trembling, and I could see both fear and relief flicker across her expression. For the first time in days, she looked like she wasn't carrying the weight alone. We went to the bedroom together. My legs felt weak, and my chest was tight as though every step toward the bed was a step toward some irreversible truth. She knelt first, her hands brushing against the frame, and when her fingers touched the wire, she recoiled slightly as if it might burn her. I crouched beside her, forcing my shaking hands to move. Together, in silence, we pulled at it, our breaths ragged, until the device finally came loose. It was small, unremarkable, just a black box with a wire trailing like a dead vein, but to me it looked monstrous. She held it in her hands like it was a confession made solid, her face twisted with grief. I stared at it for a long time, my pulse hammering in my ears, before I reached over and took it from her. The weight of it in my palm made me feel sick, but it also made me feel a strange rush of power. This thing had stolen from me, had stripped away my sense of safety, and now it was mine to destroy. I wanted to smash it right there on the floor, to break it until it was nothing but shards, but she stopped me. Her voice shook as she told me that breaking it wouldn't solve everything, that we needed to think, to plan, to make sure we weren't just reacting out of anger. Her fear was real, palpable, and I realized then how trapped she had felt all along. Whoever had forced her into this, whoever had listened to our lives through that wire, wasn't just going to disappear because we wished it. As much as I wanted to erase the device from existence, I understood she was right. So instead, I tucked it away in a drawer, hidden from sight, my stomach still knotted but my mind beginning to clear. That night, lying beside her, we talked in whispers as if the walls still had ears. She told me more about the threats, about how they had cornered her, how powerless she had felt. I listened, trying to balance my anger with compassion, trying to let her voice fill in the gaps of silence that had haunted me for weeks. Her honesty was messy and painful, but it was real. Every word cracked her open, and I could see her breaking as she admitted how scared she had been of losing me, how ashamed she was for keeping me in the dark. My heart throbbed with a mix of sorrow and love. I wanted to hate her for not trusting me, yet I couldn't stop reaching for her hand, couldn't stop brushing away her tears. Love doesn't vanish just because it's been betrayed, it lingers, bruised but stubborn, and that night it kept me tethered to her. When dawn came, we hadn't slept. We sat on the floor by the bed, our backs against the wall, the first light spilling over us as though trying to cleanse the night. I told her we couldn't hide anymore. If she wanted me to stand beside her, if we were truly in this together, then we needed to face it head-on. She nodded, her fingers tangled with mine, and I saw a flicker of determination in her tired eyes. For the first time since I discovered that wire, I felt less alone. Fear still pulsed inside me, but it was different now. It was fear carried by two hearts instead of one, and somehow that made it bearable. Later that day, I found myself holding the device again. It felt less like a weapon now and more like a test, a challenge to our love. I looked at her across the room, her eyes swollen from tears but her shoulders straighter than before, and I realized that something had shifted between us. The betrayal was still raw, but there was also a spark of unity, of defiance. We had been invaded, yes, but we had also survived the discovery, the confrontation, the breaking point. What came next would be hard, maybe even dangerous, but for the first time I felt that we might have the strength to face it. I squeezed the device in my hand until my knuckles ached, then set it down firmly. Whatever power it had over us, it was losing its grip that night, when we finally collapsed into bed, her arms wrapped tightly around me. There was no pretending. The silence between us wasn't heavy with secrets anymore. It was the silence of two people who had been torn open and were trying to stitch themselves back together. I buried my face against her neck, inhaling the familiar scent that still calmed me, and whispered that I wasn't leaving, not yet, not like this. She kissed my forehead and promised she would never let fear come between us again. And even though part of me still ached with doubt, another part began to believe that maybe we could still fight our way back to love, that maybe we hadn't lost everything after all. The days that followed were fragile, like walking on glass that could shatter under the slightest pressure. We had removed the wire, hidden it away, and whispered promises to each other in the dark, but the wound of betrayal still lingered between us like an invisible scar. At first, I found myself pulling back without realizing it, hesitating before leaning into her kiss, questioning the sincerity in her touch, doubting the words that once felt like gospel truth. She noticed, of course she noticed, and her eyes carried that sadness I had grown to hate seeing, the sadness of a woman who feared she had broken something beyond repair. But she didn't give up. She didn't retreat into silence. Instead, she began fighting for us in the smallest, most deliberate ways, and it was in those gestures that I started to feel something shift inside me. She began leaving handwritten notes around the apartment, simple things like "You are my safe place" on the bathroom mirror, or "I love the way you laugh when you're trying not to," tucked into my book. They were not grand declarations, but each one reminded me that love lived in details, not in perfect trust. She cooked meals for me with extra care, fussing over spices she normally wouldn't, watching my reaction with hope in her eyes. And when we sat down to eat, she reached across the table to hold my hand, grounding me even when words failed. At night, she would trace circles on my arm until I drifted to sleep, even though I knew she lay awake for hours afterward, waiting to be sure I wasn't plagued by the nightmares that had started creeping into my rest point. One evening, I found myself watching her while she folded laundry, her movements slow and thoughtful, her lips pressed together as if she was deep in her own world. For a long time I just sat silently, realizing that I had missed the simple intimacy of observing her, of noticing how she hummed under her breath when she thought I wasn't listening. A strange ache bloomed in my chest, not of pain but of longing. I wanted us back, fully, desperately. I wanted to be able to touch her without remembering the sting of betrayal, to laugh with her without hearing echoes of whispered lies. So I stood up, walked to her side, and without saying a word, wrapped my arms around her. She froze for a moment, then melted into me, her body trembling as if she had been waiting for me to reach for her first. I buried my face in her shoulder, inhaling her scent, and whispered that I still wanted her, that I still loved her, and that I was trying. She turned in my arms, tears glistening in her eyes, and kissed me with such tenderness that my heart cracked wide open. It wasn't the desperate kind of kiss that begged for forgiveness. It was slow, reverent, filled with the weight of everything we had been through. I let myself lean into it, let myself forget for a few moments that anything had ever been broken. When we finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against mine and whispered, "We'll heal, even if it takes the rest of our lives." And for the first time, I believed her. From that night onward, something shifted. It wasn't that the pain vanished, it still lingered in quiet corners, ready to surface when doubt crept in, but we began to rebuild piece by piece. We took long walks together, holding hands even when silence hung between us. We cooked dinners side by side, laughing when we burned something or spilled sauce on the floor. We started talking about dreams again, about places we wanted to travel, about the home we wanted to build far away from the shadows of what had been done to us. Every conversation stitched another thread into the fabric of what we were repairing, fragile but slowly growing stronger. There were still nights when fear clawed at me. I would wake in the dark, heart pounding, convinced I heard static again, convinced that the safety was only an illusion. She would wake too, instantly aware, and pull me into her arms, holding me until the shaking passed. She never told me to stop worrying, never scolded me for doubting, she just stayed with me, her hand steady against my back, her voice whispering softly that we were safe now. Those moments mattered more than I could ever tell her, because they reminded me that she was willing to carry the weight with me, not just the joy, and little by little, the distance between us began to fade. We laughed again, real laughter that filled the apartment and echoed against the walls, chasing away the shadows that had lingered too long. We made love again, not as an escape but as a deliberate act of choosing each other, of reclaiming the intimacy that had been stolen from us. Every kiss, every touch became a declaration, a promise that we were still here, still fighting, still willing to try. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made it more precious than anything else. One night, as we lay tangled in each other's arms, she whispered that she wanted to start over completely, new place, new beginning, somewhere the past couldn't follow us. The idea made my heart race with both fear and excitement. Change was terrifying, but so was the thought of staying in the same space where we had been spied on, where our love had been tainted. I realized then that rebuilding wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about courage, about daring to create a new life together even after the old one had been cracked open. I kissed her softly, my lips trembling against hers, and told her I was ready to try. We made the decision quietly, without fireworks or dramatic declarations, just two women sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with our fingers laced together and a silent understanding growing stronger between us. Leaving wasn't easy. The apartment had held our laughter, our arguments, our first morning together after sleepless nights, but it also carried shadows now, echoes of betrayal and fear that no amount of scrubbing could erase. So we packed in silence at first, folding clothes into boxes, wrapping dishes in old newspapers, taking down the photos from the walls. Each item I touched reminded me of what we had shared and what we had endured, and though my chest tightened with grief at letting go, there was also a steady pulse of relief beneath it. She kept glancing at me, nervous, as though she expected me to change my mind at any moment. But I didn't. Every time her eyes found mine, I gave a small nod, a small smile, as if to remind her we were in this together. The night before we left, I stood in the bedroom, staring at the empty space beneath the bed where the wire had once been. The air felt lighter without it, but a chill still clung to the walls. She walked up behind me and slid her arms around my waist, resting her chin on my shoulder. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. That silence was filled with an understanding deeper than words. We were done letting fear rule us. She kissed the side of my neck softly, and I leaned back into her, closing my eyes, feeling the quiet promise in her embrace. That night we didn't talk about the past or the pain, we just held each other until sleep took us. Moving was chaos and freedom wrapped into one. The road stretched out like a ribbon of possibility, carrying us toward a town where no one knew our names, no one cared about our history, no one would plant a wire under our bed. The first night in our new place, a small rented house with creaking floors and mismatched curtains, I sat on the floor with her, boxes still stacked around us, and laughed for the first time without hesitation. She laughed too, clutching her stomach, tears streaming down her face not from sadness but from pure release. It felt like breathing after being underwater for too long. I realized then how much weight we had carried and how much lighter the world could feel when we chose to step out of the darkness together. Life didn't magically fix itself in the new town. There were still days when doubts crept in, when I questioned whether she had told me everything or whether shadows from the past would one day find us again. But she met those doubts with patience, with consistency, with a kind of steady love I hadn't recognized before. She didn't rush me, didn't demand my forgiveness as though it was her right. Instead, she earned it every day in small, quiet ways, a warm cup of coffee placed beside me in the morning, her hand finding mine as we walked down unfamiliar streets, her listening without interruption when I voiced my fears aloud. The trust came back slowly, like sunlight breaking through after a long storm, hesitant at first but growing warmer with every passing day. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, I turned to her and asked if she thought we would ever feel normal again. She was quiet for a long time, then smiled softly and said, "I don't want normal. I want us. Whatever that looks like." Her words sank into me, filling the cracks I hadn't realized were still open. Maybe we weren't meant to go back to the way things were before, maybe we weren't meant to erase the pain. Maybe the scars themselves were proof of survival, proof that we had endured something meant to break us and chose instead to rebuild. I leaned over, kissed her gently, and whispered that I didn't want normal either. I just wanted her. In time, the nightmares faded. The device under our bed became nothing more than a distant memory, a story I no longer felt haunted by but instead carried as a reminder of what we had overcome. She and I built a new rhythm, one born from honesty and resilience. We laughed more, dreamed more, dared more. We painted the walls of our little house bright colors, planted flowers in the yard, and filled the rooms with music and the scent of cooking. And slowly, the fear that had once defined us gave way to something stronger, something unshakable. Looking back, I realized they had tried to break us by turning love into surveillance, by planting doubt where trust once grew. But what they couldn't take was our choice to fight, our decision to keep holding on even when it hurt. That choice became our freedom, and that freedom became our future. As I lay in bed beside her one night, the sound of her steady breathing wrapping around me like a lullaby, I knew without doubt that we had survived the worst and come out stronger. Love, tested and scarred, had still won. And in that quiet, I finally felt safe, not because no one was watching, but because no matter what the world threw at us, we had each other, and that was enough.